Hello, I'm Chris Wood-Ellis, and I'm going to provide an overview of the state of Boreal Woodland Caribou ranges in Canada. The intent of this talk is to provide some basic information on caribou ranges as context in understanding the approach taken to dealing with caribou habitat in FSC Canada's National Forest Management Strategy. Much of this presentation was originally given at FSC's Caribou Forum in Toronto in March of 2020. In this talk, I'm going to present information on the size and location of ranges, including overlap with forest management units. We'll look at disturbance dynamics, levels of risk and the relationship between risk and range size and overlap with management units, and a quick bit on population estimates by province. In this talk, you'll hear me make reference to three important documents that capture the recent thinking about Boreal woodland caribou ecology and management. These are Environment Canada's 2011 Scientific Assessment to Inform the Identification of Critical Habitat, the 2012 Recovery Strategy and a recent update produced in 2019, and the 2016 Guidance for Range Planning. Starting with some context about the 51 ranges that are recognized in Canada, ranges occur in 7 provinces from British Columbia in the west to Newfoundland and Labrador, and also in the Northwest Territories. This graph shows the size of ranges. On the x-axis are the different recognized ranges organized by province. The variation in range sizes is apparent, and there are 5 ranges that stand out as being considerably larger than the others. This graph shows the same information as the one above, but the y-axis has been adjusted to better show the difference in sizes. There are 5 really large ranges indicated by the arrows. They are in the Northwest Territories, 2 in Saskatchewan, the Far North Range in Ontario, and the Quebec Range, which at more than 62 million hectares is the largest in the country. So there seems to be sort of a tri-modal distribution of range size. So some are very large, some are mid-size, like the circled ones in Newfoundland and Ontario, and some are small, like the other circled ones in British Columbia and Manitoba. It should be pointed out here that there continues to be some flux in the definition of range boundaries. Although there are 51 ranges identified in the Federal Recovery Strategy, both the 2012 and 2019 versions, there are ongoing efforts to refine the boundaries of some ranges based on new and improved information. So for example, the Far North Range in Ontario, the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry is in the process of redefining that single range into 6 other ranges. However, in this talk, we will continue to use the 51 ranges as they continue to be the basis upon which the Environment Canada and climate change documentation is based and upon which most management efforts are continuing. To some extent, the size and resolution of ranges tends to be related to the richness of information that was available to define them. So generally, the richer the information related to broad habitat types, movement of animals within ranges, the quality and quantity of population information, there is a tendency towards more well-delineated and to some extent smaller range sizes. In total, the area encompassed by Boreal woodland caribou ranges in Canada is almost 245 million hectares. However, about 2/3 of that occurs in the 5 largest ranges. This map shows the overlap of caribou ranges and area-based forest management units in Canada. The ranges are identified as the yellow shaded areas, and forest management units that overlap caribou ranges are the sort of many colored shapes across the mostly southern portions of the boreal forest here. This graph shows the proportion of caribou ranges in forest management units. The 5 large ranges are indicated by the red arrows, and with the exception of the SK2 range, they have relatively small extent of overlap with caribou ranges. Some other ones, like those identified here, also have no or little overlap, but many have a considerable extent of overlap. About 1/4 of the area of all caribou ranges overlaps forest management units. However, the disproportionate influence of the 5 largest ranges is apparent here too, as when they are excluded, about 3/4 of the area of caribou ranges overlaps with forest management units. This graph is taken from Environment Canada's 2011 Scientific Assessment of Critical Caribou Habitat. It shows the relationship between total habitat disturbance on the x-axis and mean recruitment measured as calves per 100 cows on the y-axis. The data here were taken from 24 ranges across Canada for which there was sufficient information to assist in calibrating the relationship. Disturbance here includes both forest fire and anthropogenic disturbances such as roads, linear rights-of-way, and forest harvesting. However, the relationship is most strongly influenced by the anthropogenic disturbance compared to the natural disturbances. So this graph shows that there is a striking and strong relationship that shows a negative association between disturbance and recruitment. There are lots of interesting nuances to this work and to the graph, such as the definitions of disturbance, the use of buffer zones, etc. To get a better explanation of these, refer to the scientific assessment and the documents that I mentioned earlier in this talk. The same data used to produce the previous graph is the basis of this relationship that shows a disturbance-based population growth function with levels of total disturbance on the x-axis and the probability of observing stable or positive growth over a 20-year period on the y-axis. The scientists who developed the federal recovery strategy identified as an acceptable benchmark achieving a 60% probability of population growth or stability. And this equates to a 35% level of disturbance. So this is very much a risk management approach. Even with disturbance limited to 35% at the range level, the probability of population stability is only 60%. However, as this function shows, to incur a much higher probability of stability or lower level of risk would require pretty low levels of disturbance. This graph shows the levels of disturbance for all 51 ranges in Canada. The black line shows 35% level of disturbance, so most ranges in Canada exceed the 35% benchmark. The graph also shows the proportion of area disturbed by fire and anthropogenic causes, and it's apparent that there is considerable variation in the relative contributions of these sources to the total levels of disturbance, and this complicates forest management considerably in some areas relative to the objective of keeping total disturbance at less than 35%. Further complication can occur in circumstances such as shown here for caribou ranges across northern Ontario, where disturbance is not distributed evenly through ranges. So in this figure here, the light blue are areas of anthropogenic disturbance, the red is natural disturbance, and areas that are in white have no or very low levels of disturbance. So in general, where forest management is permitted, levels of disturbance are considerably higher. In order to make classification of ranges according to risk relatively simple, the federal recovery strategy calculated the probability of achieving a self-sustaining outcome based on range condition, population size, and trend, and then further simplified the determination by creating 3 categories of outcomes for ranges. So self-sustaining, where the probability of achieving a self-sustaining outcome is greater than 60%, about as likely as not to be self-sustaining, where the probability is between 40 and 60%, and not self-sustaining, where the probability is less than 40%. This slide shows the distribution of risk across the 51 ranges. Slightly more than half of the ranges in the country are not self-sustaining, and only 15 are considered to be self-sustaining. It's impactful to look at this information a bit more visually. So ranges in white are estimated to be self-sustaining. Those in yellow are on the cusp between self-sustaining and not self-sustaining. And those in red are estimated to be not self-sustaining. It's pretty striking that all the ranges in British Columbia and Alberta are not self-sustaining, and there are ranges that are also considered to be not self-sustaining pretty much distributed across the country, with the exception of Saskatchewan and the Northwest Territories. I think this is a pretty sobering graphic here, and an interesting synopsis of all the sort of graphs and analyses that has been presented to this point in this presentation. So moving on, I'm just going to present a bit of information about populations by province. There is a considerable uncertainty about the exact numbers of caribou in each province, and there is some interesting science being undertaken to help refine the estimates. But nonetheless, this graph gives a sense of current thinking. There's lots of interesting divergence here. For example, although British Columbia and Alberta have a relatively high number of ranges, they tend to be pretty small, and the total populations in those provinces are believed to be pretty low, and some ranges are in dire straits with less than 100 animals. Another piece of information, if we look at Quebec, the population seems to be pretty high, but approximately 90% of those animals are estimated to be in the very large Quebec range. There is more information on these estimates in the 2019 Federal Recovery Strategy, so you should look there to think about this more deeply. So now just a very quick look at the relationship between risk and range size. The range size categories shown across the bottom here are arbitrary, but there seems to be a pretty clear and not surprising relationship between range size and risk. Generally, bigger ranges are in better shape in terms of sustainability status. And here is a quick look at the relationship between risk and overlap with forest management units. Not surprisingly, there is a generally higher degree of risk associated with higher levels of overlap. So just a quick overview then. There's sort of a trimodal distribution of range sizes, and about 3/4 of the area of medium and small size ranges overlap with forest management units. Most ranges are near or over the 35% disturbance threshold, and more than half of ranges are considered to be not self-sustaining. That includes all of the ranges in British Columbia and Alberta. And in general, the degree of risk seems to vary with range size and overlap with forest management units. So that was a pretty quick overview of boreal caribou ranges in Canada. A lot of information to absorb, hopefully not too much. If you have questions, I urge you to look at the Federal Recovery Strategy documents or send us an email at the address shown here. Thanks for taking the time to go through this presentation.